And instead of speaking about how to enhance legacies, I decided to focus the audience's attention on the risks to legacies.
Thank you so much for tuning into with Journey with Christian Evans podcast with Pax Fortis Family Office with Andrew Morali as the CIO. And we've got a special guest on today, Robert Mancuso. And one of the things is the growing class warfare against success. Why government is actually really punishing those that are successful and that have produced wealth, and the negative context around wealth and wealth generation. Today, that's one of the reasons why we have Robert Mancuso on. He actually wrote an incredible article. He's on Capitol Hill talking to congressmen from all different sides of the aisle, left and right, discussing why the underappreciated risk to legacies and why this is extremely important on what the Biden administration has proposed in regards to taxing unrealized capital gains. We're going to be unpacking that and really what it means for not only the wealth creators, the high net worth, ultra high net worth investors, but also those that want to generate wealth in the U.S. Please welcome my guest, Robert Mancuso. Robert, how are you doing, my man?
Well, thank you so much for your kind introduction, and I'm delighted and privileged to be part of your podcast. I understand it's one of the most successful.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
On
Let
air.
me just I want to set the stage, Robert, because you wrote several different articles, and like I mentioned, you're talking to congressmen. You are, running point on having these conversations to influence in the way you can legislation. And why don't you just set the stage a little bit on what's happening, what you're seeing in the pipeline, and why you're so concerned that you became very vocal about this.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. The story begins with a conference that I attended almost a year ago in Beverly Hills when I was asked to speak as a member of a panelist. And the topic assigned by the sponsor of the conference was how families can enhance their legacies. So there were 5 members of the panel. I was the last to speak. The other 4 individuals spoke to the subject. I decided when it was my turn to turn the subject around. And instead of speaking about how to enhance legacies, I decided to focus the audience's attention on the risks to legacies. And I did that by drawing the attention of the attendees. This was in Beverly Hills in November 2023, to Assembly Bill 259, which if you live in California, you might recognize as the California wealth tax. So the audience consisted of 150 family offices and advisors and CIOs to that type of organization. And as I got deeper into the operation of Assembly Bill 259, there became a hush over the audience because instead of listening with half an ear, they decided to really listen with full attention. The Assembly Bill is sweeping in so many different directions, but let's focus on the most pernicious of the content, which is the taxation of unrealized appreciation. Now, this theme has become adopted in not only the state of California, but in 7 other jurisdictions. The version of the California wealth tax has been adopted in Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, New York, Oregon, and Washington in the legislative proposals that were introduced in 2023. And it's interesting, Christian, and your audience, that these states represent 60% of the entire wealth in the United States. So the takeaway that I wanted the audience to recognize was, for the very first time, these proposals tax a new category. They tax wealth, not income. And as you know from history of the income tax law, the word income is there for a reason. So the legislative proposal that was enacted or proposed in 2023 created an entire new category, which was the taxation of wealth. And wealth is monitored by having a resident of the state of California file his or her net worth statement with the state, including the methodology by which the owner of those assets valued those assets. So it was enormously intrusive. in terms of sharing confidential information. And for the bill for taxable years beginning on or after January 2026 would impose an annual tax of 1% on a resident's worldwide net income in excess of $50 million. Now, that's an awful lot of money. But in the state of California, when you think of Silicon Valley and you think of the entertainment industry and you think of sports figures and you think of real estate accumulated over many, many years, if not generations, you can easily understand that the impact of a $50 million cutoff would be very, very onerous. So the conference attendees were very concerned about the operation of this bill. After an active Q&A session, I stepped down from the platform. A number of people came up to me and said, "Thank you for the courage of sharing this information with us, because we had no idea that Sacramento was doing this." So after thanking those people for their kind words, I decided to go back to Palm Beach. I worked on an article for 2.5 months. I wrote the article, shared it with you and others, and it addresses in great detail how there seems to be a negative narrative that is running through society that not only questions the accumulation of wealth and the accumulation of success, but actually suggests that wealth and the American dream are not something to be admired, that wealth is almost a bad thing, and that the American dream has been replaced by a different type of goal. And the goal perhaps is social welfare or another metric, but the foundation of America has been built on the American dream, which has allowed immigrants to come to this country with barely anything more than their hard work and willingness to sacrifice for themselves and their family, and to build up over years something that didn't exist before. And there are thousands and thousands, millions of examples of the American dream prospering, lifting up, edifying the American workforce and America in general. And now it seems like there are certain legislators at both the state and the federal level that want to denigrate the American dream, want to replace it with something else, some other philosophy. And I think it's foreboding. And I've decided to focus my efforts to bring this negative narrative into full focus and to help people, particularly families, understand the consequences of remaining silent.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to share. Go ahead, Andrew. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's terrific. And this was something when I read this article, it shocked me that I hadn't heard of this. And it's been implemented in, as you say, 60% of the net worth of our nation is already under some sort of ruling of this. That was, I think, frightening to me to realize how far this is. Not early stages of this. We're kind of halfway through the game, and there's the risk that this goes to all parties. One of the things I thought was interesting was the outcome of Moore versus the U.S. that could redefine how income tax is kind of qualified. What is income? If you wouldn't mind, catch us up on why that is even kind of in the courts, what the outcome could be, because I think that's where I see the root of this is deeming income as net worth and not that, right? Income is money that has been received that I am holding, I'm touching, right? Are the cards stacked against the people in that sense? Is it weighted that it's probably going to go towards unrealized gains in net worth, or do we still have a fighting chance in Moore versus the U.S.?
Well, thank you for that very good question, Andrew. Let me emphasize that these proposals are just proposals. Not one of these initiatives has yet been signed into law. I personally think that the outcome of the upcoming November election will determine whether at the state level any of these initiatives are adopted. I personally predict that the state of California will enact a version of its wealth tax, depending upon which party is successful on November 5th. So to the extent that You're 100% right. This is not a early issue. This issue has been well developed and is moving in the wrong direction. There is still time to act on it and be prepared, which is part of the reason why I'm so pleased to be part of your podcast to bring voice and awareness to this issue. And that's also picking up on a point that Christian made earlier. That's why I was in Washington last Thursday as a member of the Family Enterprise USA delegation, visiting with members of both the Senate and the House to help them understand the impact of various legislative proposals on family-held businesses. But coming back to your question, Moore versus the United States was resolved in a manner that opens theoretically the door to the taxation of unrealized appreciation. Now, if you read the ruling carefully, the majority opinion writers went out of their way to make it as narrow a ruling as possible so that it applied to the fact pattern of that particular case and does not represent a sweeping precedent. Now, I've spoken with people who have read the article, read the ruling, and practiced in front of the Supreme Court. The consequences of Moore are troubling. It has now opened the door, even if it's only a crack, to the concept that the Congress has the authority, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, has the authority to tax some form of unrealized appreciation. Now, I hope that that is eventually ruled in the reverse as the cases wind their way through the courts. I cannot imagine at the federal level, and I know that certain politicians of a certain party are proposing at the federal level the taxation of unrealized income. And if that were to be adopted, I think it would be immediately challenged. And the challenge would take years, and the challenge would be one of the most vociferous challenges that any case could imagine experiencing, because it throws into entirely new category how success is defined. And
Yes.
you're absolutely right, Andrew. The historical metric has been realization. You need to
Right.
realize a gain from your risk taking in order to be considered generating income. You cannot generate income by simply sitting back and watching your holding in a private company be valued higher next year than it was last year. So during the course of my conference, just to give you an example, I drew to the attention of the audience that if Assembly Bill 259 had been adopted in 2017, in an era of almost zero interest rates for years and years, for 5 years, and you had founded a tech startup in 2017, it would not be unusual in that era of zero interest rates to go from a $50 million valuation for illustration purposes to the next year, a $100 million valuation. And then another year later, $200 million valuation. And by the end of 2021, let's say your ownership interest in this new startup was valued, the startup was valued at $400 million. And let's say you were a founder, you would therefore be subject to the application of Assembly Bill 259 because you would have a net worth in excess of $50 million. If Assembly Bill 259 had been adopted, you would owe the state of California 1% on the appreciation of the value of your equity, even though you didn't sell a share, and most likely you were not allowed to sell a share. So it's beyond absurd to think that this law can make any sense, but that doesn't mean that the legislators in Sacramento are restrained in their imagination that, yes, wealth is wealth, even if you're legally barred from selling shares. As both of you know, many private companies, especially Silicon Valley startups, restrict employees from the sale of their stock except under very limited circumstances and to a very select group of other shareholders, particularly back to the company. So it's incredibly convoluted thinking, but unfortunately, that's what the Assembly bill provides.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to mention, because what I see right now is a lot of individuals don't understand how business works. And let me just explain a little bit further. So what I've noticed, even with the price reduction or the price controls that, the Harris administration, the Biden administration kind of mentioned that they may be working on, the assumption is that during, we see, if you go to the grocery store, you see the Walmarts, the Costco's, the whatever, and you see the price increases. But that's the assumption that, these companies are padding all their pockets and they're just charging the customer. But if you actually look, and this is all public information, if you look at their EBITDA margins, and I mentioned this, before, if you look at their EBITDA margins in 2020 and 2019 versus right now, they're almost identical. They're very similar. Now, why am I saying this? It means that it's not that these companies are padding their pockets. It's not that they're making more money. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because it's when you add the government into something and control, it just hurts the whole flow of systems and it actually hurts the end consumer. So let me share with you something in regards to detailed Harris tax proposals. And this is by Tax Notes. It was published recently. So their major business provision modeled increased the corporate income tax rate from 21 to 28%, increased the corporate alternative minimum tax introduced in the Inflation Reduction Act from 15 to 21%, and then also quadruple the stock buyback tax implemented from 1% to 4%. And then also continue for capital gains, estate tax provisions, and individuals. Increase top individual income tax rate to 39.6% on income above $400,000. Tax long-term capital gains and qualified dividends at 28%. And then tax unrealized capital gains at death above a $5 million exemption, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm curious, Robert, why, one, how that will impact negatively the economy, reinvestment, things like that will hinder the U.S. economy.
Well, Christian, there's an army of experts from various camps who recognize that the proposals, even taken singularly, but certainly taken as a group, could easily have an absolutely horrific effect on the capital markets. What the politicians don't talk about is the impact on one of the most important assets that the United States has, which is its capital market system. The reason why companies come to America to list is because of the efficiency and the reliability and integrity of the U.S. capital market systems. Earlier in my career, I worked for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission after I graduated law school. And I've been a student of the SEC ever since, even though I gave up the practice of law. But one of the most important assets that our country has in the world is its capital market function, which is the ability to raise capital for entrepreneurs to produce innovation. The consequence of the proposals that you recited could have a incredibly negative effect on not only the U.S. capital markets for existing investors, but for all those other investors who want to come to this country and want to do business and list their companies on our stock exchanges as opposed to other stock exchanges. So the proposals are very, very troubling. I believe that if you add on Senate Bill 4824 to the list of proposals, you could easily come away with the point of view that the people in Washington are trying to move away from capitalism.
Yep.
If you're not familiar with Senate Bill 4824, let me recite it for you. Senate Bill 4824 was introduced by Senator Elizabeth Warren on July 29th of this year, a little bit more than 2 months ago. It was co-sponsored with 7 other senators, all from the same party as herself. The bill is entitled the American Housing and Mobility Act. It's 150 pages long, but when you get to page 125, you'll see buried in the back that it is the most sweeping reform of the estate tax system in our country in history. So on page 125, for the next 25 pages, Senate Bill 4824, it restrains, limits, eliminates numerous elements of how families and individuals transfer their assets upon their death. Buried into the restrictions on things like grantor trusts, life insurance trusts, GRATs, numerous other vehicles, generation skipping trusts, numerous other reliable vehicles that have been adopted and used for years, Senator Warren has decided that she and her co-sponsors want to raise the estate tax rates. Now, the current federal estate tax rate is 40%. According to Senator Warren, that 40% is going to go as high as 75%. And I'm not sure that your audience knows that. I'm not sure the members of your audience who are thinking about how can they transfer upon their death the hard work and success that they've earned over their life to their children or grandchildren. According to Senator Warren, 40% is not high enough, and it goes up depending upon the value of your estate to 75%. Now, that bear in mind, Andrew and Christian, that that's just the federal estate tax. If you were to add the state estate tax on top, now you'd probably get some offsetting credits between one and the other. But you can imagine easily that there would be almost nothing left.
It's absurd. I think it's concerning, and I think your point of saying there's a shift away from capitalism is the underlying, the boogeyman in the closet that we're not talking about, but we're seeing these policy shifts towards a state elevated, state driven society that is one of the parts I really appreciated in your article was the question of and I think it would be a good topic to discuss is what's the underlying motive here? Is it, oh, really, we just want to solve the deficit, $34 trillion, and, this is how we're going to do that, but we're not going to cut off any spending from the government, right? We're just going to tax you into oblivion. Or is it more of I want weak, subservient citizens so that therefore there's an elevated necessity for the state, the power of the state rises, and there is a lack of individualism, a lack of the ability to resist a tyrannical government that taxes you at, you get 20% of your generational wealth left for the next folks. That's what I see it as. Do you see it as a shift, one, away from capitalism, more towards a socialistic society, but two, is the underlying purpose and reasoning of that of a balanced budget and solving our debt crisis, or is it purely from a power grab to depress the individual and raise the state?
Andrew, you're raising enormously important and significant questions. I try not to assign motives to people because I think there's a possibility of misunderstanding. But I went back and did research on the legislative history for Assembly Bill 259. As I was doing my article, I decided to go back and try to understand what the motives were. And so in focusing on the legislative history, I read some of the statements made by the sponsor. The sponsor of the Assembly Bill 259 it's been proposed a number of times. So the sponsor at the time that I did my research was a 22-year-old individual who had just been elected to the state legislature a year earlier. He, given his youth, had a previous position as a legislative aide to a union or a not-for-profit. And he went on the floor of the State House and said that wouldn't it be great by taxing wealth, we'll be able to fill the hole that the California state legislature now projects. At the time that he introduced this bill, the projected deficit for the state of California was 21 billion. And he proudly said, we'll be able to collect $22 billion. So he took great pride in the fact that he came up with a means by which the deficit could be filled, and use that as a reason to support his proposal. So, without assigning motives, I think you need to look at actions more than try and discern intentions. The actions of certain legislators indicate a desire to move away from the American dream. The actions of the legislators indicate a commitment to move away from what has made America great in the past, which is capitalism. I think the actions also belie, betray, reveal a desire on the part of certain legislators to replace capitalism with something else. They don't go into specifics of what that something else is. I leave it to you and to your audience to discern that. But I think it's clear that the sentiments first expressed in California have somehow gathered enough momentum and swept across the country so that it now influences Washington legislators as well. Otherwise, you wouldn't see Senate Bill 4824. You wouldn't see the concerted effort in Moore versus the United States Supreme Court case, nor would you see the so-called Billionaires Act that was introduced by Bernie Sanders. So I was in London in June of this year, invited to give a speech to a conference of family offices that were largely based offshore. And I was asked to speak about megatrends. And one of the megatrends that I identified, Andrew and Christian, was the convergence of thinking between state legislators and federal legislators. Because I think people don't realize the connection, don't realize that the state governments are truly the laboratory of a lot of what goes on in Washington. And I made that statement, and the people in the audience took note of it. And here we now have evidence that there is this connection between what goes on in Sacramento, Albany, Springfield, the most liberal of the states, and the influence that they have in Washington, D.C. That's why I was there last Thursday. That's why I'm going back. That's why I'm concerned about the impact of these legislative points of view, because it represents a change in narrative. It represents a viewpoint that I think is threatening the American dream. It is attempting to replace it with something that is not yet defined. But in my humble opinion, the American dream is what has held this country together for easily a couple hundred years, especially with the first wave of immigration in the 1850s. You can get plenty of evidence of how people have come to this country for the same reason, which is economic betterment for themselves, for their families, taking great risks, whether those risks were crossing the Great Plains and going to California to look for a better life, or just the janitor who comes to this country with just a desire to protect and preserve his family's well-being, and one day becomes the owner of the building in which he used to mop floors. So I'm very concerned about the threats that these legislative proposals, both at the state level and the federal level, have on the American dream. And that's what I decided to dedicate myself to.
I love it, man. I love it. And just I want to say something here because I think it's important, on Andrew's point when he was asking, are they trying to use it to just, eliminate the deficit, or are they sitting there trying to just use it for state control? Well, this is actually just an estimate. Estimate the Harris plan would raise 2.2 trillion of tax revenues from corporations and 1.2 trillion from individuals. But through the years of 2025 through 2034, that's 9 years. And if you actually look at this, the U.S. spent 6.29 trillion in the first part of fiscal year 2024. So it just, even when we start implementing all these things in the taxes upon individuals and corporations, the result is minuscule. We're spending
Yeah.
6.2 in the first year, first quarter of 2024, and then we're bringing in 2.2, yay, in the next 9 years. It does not make any sense financially.
It
So
doesn't make sense.
I wanted to say that real quick. Robert, I'd love to get your perspective on that, or Andrew as well.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think it's like your
I'll
house
let
is
Andrew
burning.
speak.
Yeah, it's like your house is burning and you're going and you're gonna steal the water from all your neighbors and pour it on the house, and yet at the same time you're pouring dump trucks full of gasoline on top of the house, and it just doesn't make sense because the spending like that doesn't solve the problem, right? And so the question becomes, if that's not solving the problem, what is it solving, right? And what is it? Significantly higher tax on individuals and unrealized gains and all of that. If it's not, we'll put the lipstick on the pig, right? Oh, it's solving the deficit. We're going to raise taxes. But if it's truly not solving that problem, the question becomes, what problem is it solving, or perceived problem? And that's for me what it gets back to this, the power of the state, a more subservient citizen that doesn't have the power to rebel or to leave or to protect themselves. We can call it's solving the deficit, or we're taxing the rich, but in reality, the house is still on fire and you're pouring gasoline on it. So what is it doing is you're causing all of your neighbors' water bills to go up, and so they have left, I think with politics is such a jaded perception is not reality, right? And so that's what with when analyzing policy, I always ask, is this actually solving the problem? 9 times out of 10, it's not. And so then you ask, what implications will this have? And is that the problem that's actually being solved? So I want to go back to Robert. One of the other interesting points of this article was that this is not the first time this has been tried, right? You mentioned there's several states throughout the European Union and Eastern Europe that have tried this, had it, and repealed it. And I'm curious what the impact was. Was it society crumbled? Was it stagnation of the economic growth? Like, if we can learn from history, relative recent history, I mean, a lot of them were repealed in the early 2000s, but what was the impact of this type of legislation in other countries? Why was it repealed, and have they been able to recover, or was it actually was it good for their societies? Did it actually balance the vote? What was the impact of other nations that have tried this?
It didn't work. In case after case after case, it didn't have the expected benefit and it drove people out. That's why it was rescinded soon after adoption in almost every single jurisdiction where it was proposed. Wealth taxes are, as you correctly said, Andrew, not a new idea, but it's a new old failed idea. And the willingness of Americans to ignore the experience of our allies in Europe is another tell. It's another indication that they're not looking at reality, they're looking at philosophy. So Austria, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, Iceland, Luxembourg, and Sweden. That's a pretty significant cross-section of European allies and Western democracies, Western-style democracies. They all tried wealth taxes, and then they realized they didn't work and they rescinded them. However, in the U.S., the people that have influence are ignorant or unwilling or don't care, or they say it'll be different here, whatever excuse they use, they're pushing the country in a direction that I believe the rank and file are not aware of. I'm not sure that there are many people who are going to go to vote on November 5th that realize that tax policy is on the ballot. You can think of a lot of things that are on the ballot on November 5th, but let me assure you and your audience that tax policy for the next 10 years is going to be on the ballot in a way that has never been true before, perhaps not since Ronald Reagan.
It's a great point to bring emphasis and a spotlight to. So obviously there's two courses of action as I see it of what do we do, right? And I'm curious what the offshore family office reception to this was, well, thank goodness I got the hell out of there, right? Because, from my perspective, there's only, as you said, in the European nations, people left. And that's, I think, but I don't think that's a good answer, right? To run away from the problem and let the house burn to the ground. I think we have an obligation and a duty to fight for the nation that we love and the ideals that we believe in versus, okay, well, I'm going to take all my assets and go to the Cook Islands and set up a trust that you can't touch, and I'm going to run away to the Caribbean or Puerto Rico or what have you. Because we do love this nation and everything that it brings and the history of it. And, the football games or the symphony that starts out with the Star Spangled Banner, like that's what brings us back to our roots. And so I don't think that running away and kind of going, well, that's their problem is the right answer. But I can see where it's a pretty logical course of action to just say, well, hey, I'm going to protect mine. And so I'm going to run away and figure out a way to shelter it. Two questions. One, what was the reception or the feedback from the offshore family offices or other large families that you've spoken with that have heard about this? And then two, what do you think is the proper course of action to fight for this? Obviously on the ballots to call our legislators. Does that work? Is that an effective strategy? How do we kind of fight this and challenge this? And then what was the reception of those that are already offshore or thinking about going offshore?
All right, two great questions. I spoke on June 4th. 30 days later, on July 4th, the government of the United Kingdom changed. The Labour Party swept into power, replaced the Tories, and if I had spoken on July 4th, my comments would have been welcomed by a different type of audience. On July 4th, people said, oh my goodness, what Mancuso thought about has actually happened here in our home. We now have a party in power that is going to tax us in ways that we never thought of before. So in a way, I was prophetic on June 4th in bringing to the attention of the audience that you need to be aware of what goes on in your parliament. And then 30 days later, wow, what happened was a crushing defeat for the Tories and a landslide in favor of the Labour Party. And one of the first things that the Labour Party said they were going to do is tax non-doms. So the non-dom status has been part of the UK tax operation for easily 50 years. So in taxing non-doms or non-domiciliaries, the Labour Party is saying, we're going after those who have money. And the consequences, people are already thinking about leaving the UK. I subscribe to a number of services that try and identify what people in the UK are thinking about as well as other countries. People are already thinking of leaving the UK for other jurisdictions. Italy apparently is one of the most popular places. So here we are. Tax policy drives population. Tax policy drives innovation. Tax policy encourages the fulfillment of the dream that has allowed America to become the most powerful and the most freedom-loving country in the world. And yet it's under attack, and the consequences are we must speak up. We must rally those who feel differently and make sure that our voices are heard and that we are not silenced.
Yeah, I want to ask you this as well, just kind of pivoting the question a little bit. We have seen billionaires recently have a very negative connotation We have also, though, we have seen, and I think you mentioned this earlier on, there's just this negative connotation in culture right now. I don't know if it's just the younger generation or it's the middle generation, whatever it is, that they're, negative connotation toward wealth and wealth creation and producing and creating. And we have seen, and this is true, we have seen a lot of billionaires, their wealth drastically increase. And so there is a delta. There's a difference between obviously the top 0.001 percenters versus the high, middle income to lower income. So there is this huge kind of gap a little bit. However,
Right.
though, the thing is that we've never seen opportunity like this before. We have people on Instagram and influencers or creators that are making millions of dollars or even 100,000, 200,000. So they don't have to have a job. They're over here making money. Is it in that hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars? No, but they have an opportunity, unlike before. In the 80s, you wouldn't be able to sit there and be a mom of four, post pictures on Instagram, and all of a sudden make, another $70,000, right? That's real stuff's happening, or we're seeing Shopify. So the opportunity right now is democratized. But I would just want to get your perspective. One, why do you think there's such a negative connotation toward it? Or maybe is it just more of a macro media approach? And the reality is that sentiment's not there, where people actually enjoy the wealth creation. They love it. They think it's awesome. And there is not this hatred toward billionaires. Or do you think that is prevalent? And is that a concern that we should be aware of?
Well, that's a sociological driven question that I think will be studied for years and years and years. The feeling, and it's only a feeling, is that the media has played a great part in convincing people that those that are up there, wherever up there is, don't deserve to be up there. And my point of view is, without personalizing it, if you're a billionaire, it's because you've done something that no one else did. You may have founded a company, and how many jobs are now associated with Amazon? Let's just think about that for a second. How many people draw an income because Amazon is what it is? Easily millions of jobs are dependent upon the success of and the determination of a handful of people as represented by Jeff Bezos. So putting him, just trying to draw the distinction between person and policy and ignoring the personality, there isn't a billionaire who is a billionaire, whether it's a man or a woman, who has not created jobs. And in the narrative that exists in today's society, they focus only on the dollars, but not the benefits. The benefits of becoming a billionaire, the consequence of becoming a billionaire, are the benefits of hundreds of thousands of other people having a better life, having a job, having a career, having an upward mobility. Even just the inspiration that comes from saying, well, I know John. I didn't think that he was that smart. And yet now he's done something that no one else could have thought of. I want to do that myself. So there are so many wonderful aspects to success. And I focus on the societal benefits. How many jobs were created? How many households? Part of the reason that I care so much about family-held businesses is that a family business not only supports the family that owns the business, but the hundreds of employees that family business employs and the community in which that family business is located. So think about NAFTA a long, long, long time ago. How many businesses between the East Coast and the West Coast just dried up and blew away in dust because all the jobs were taken to Mexico? We don't want that to happen again. We don't want the mills that used to provide wool and cotton to dry up and disappear, because not only do the families that own those businesses become bankrupt, but the thousands of employees that relied on those businesses and the communities in which those businesses were housed suffer. That invites drug addiction. That invites the breakdown of the safety net that exists because the family business is the biggest benefactor of the local hospital. The family business is the biggest benefactor of the child care agency and the biggest benefactor of the addiction center. That's a society, as a community safety net. And if you tear that safety net, you're inviting drug addiction, you're inviting alcohol addiction, you're inviting mental illness and depression. It's all a connected, a series of forces which are central to the and derive strength from the fact that a local business is successful. And the media doesn't address this. You can address this. You have many, many, many millions of followers. You and your expertise can bring the contrary point of view to millions of people. That's why what you do is so important. That's why who you are is so critical, because you can present a more complete, a more accurate description of success.
Well, I appreciate that. And one of the biggest things, and that's why we love having guests on you, like yourself, so we can share this beautiful, beautiful wealth creation and really, this optimism. And just to reiterate what you said, I see it here in my hometown in Ohio, born and raised, and I saw this huge just decrease in jobs, opportunities, manufacturing, work, whatever it is. They went other places because the city just didn't do so well to recruit them. And you saw, guess what happened? Crime drastically went up, homeless went up, mental health went up, everything negatively went up because all of a sudden there was a decrease in job creation in that environment. And there's other cities around us that are just excelling and doing great. And again, it's sad to see how that's a direct correlation. And so all of a sudden, when we start seeing more businesses come in, we'll start seeing that decrease as well. And it's just, I'm part of a nonprofit with the board there, and it's just so, and they help a lot of the homeless. They help a lot of the mentally ill. They help a lot of people in the prisons and stuff like that to get out and next steps. And it's just, it's very devastating to see the metrics on this. And I like to bring it locally because then you just multiply that throughout the United States. And I think that's very important. Andrew, I'd love for you to get your feedback as well.
No, this has been a fabulous conversation, Robert. I appreciate your expertise, everything that you put into this article to bring this to the forefront. One of my favorite lines, there's a few of what you said that population follows tax policy, I think is a great snippet and is very true. I love this nation. If I got to move to Italy, that's not the worst place to move. But I do think that this it's a great concern, and we're at the precipice of what does this country look like in 25 years, and it could look very, very different, and be far less of the ladder that it has been for the last 200 years. And I think that's what saddens those of us that have the guts to look at these problems in the face, love the nation that we're fortunate enough to be from and to love. But I don't think anyone, left or right, whichever party you're from, would say we're against one of the big topics of immigration, right? No one's against immigration because we all understand that that's what has built this country, and it's the ladder that we climb. But it's about, what does this place look like in 25 years? And is it still a ladder that someone from Mexico or Venezuela can come to legally and build a business and climb up to own, a flower store, whatever, right? All of the amazing stories that have come out of this place over the last several hundred years. Or does this become a socialistic kind of subservient society that has a strong state and people are taxed into oblivion and innovation really stops? And so I think it's a very important topic. I'm grateful for you bringing this to the forefront. It's something that I will partner with you in championing of bringing attention to this, because there's so many things that are on the ballot this year, but policy that swept under the rug of let's not focus on that. And it's very important and has a huge impact on where we're going as a nation. So I really appreciate the time and for you coming on and sharing your thoughts with us.
Well, you gentlemen are most welcome. I'm indebted to you. I also want to commend you I also want to encourage you, support you. You are in a rare place where you can, because of your advocacy and your intelligence, can bring to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, a more complete picture. And I believe that you are leaders in demonstrating an alternative way of communicating. And the alternative way of communicating is for people to listen to those who have insights and appreciate a different point of view. And the different point of view is the American dream is worth preserving. The American dream is the foundation of our country. And if you can bring on individuals who can espouse that, your listeners are going to be grateful to you, and I'm grateful to you as well.
100%. Guys, that is our special guest, the one and only Robert Mancuso. Robert, I appreciate you being on here. It was a great conversation. We'll have to have you on as things keep moving forward and see what happens. Maybe after the election, maybe after the election, we'll see what happens, and say, oh shit, or
Love
say,
it.
oh, I'm glad we did, whatever it may be. But Robert, guys, until next time, be uncommon if you can. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Right.
Robert,
Bye-bye.
dude, that was a lot.